Welcome back to Bloodstained Backstories, the podcast where we delve into the twisted minds of history's most notorious criminals. I'm your host, Jace, and today we're exploring the chilling story of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, also known as the Lonely Hearts Killers. Raymond Fernandez was born in 1914. He served in the Spanish Merchant Navy and British intelligence services during World War II. He was injured during the war, and when he was released from the hospital, he stole clothing and was arrested. During the time that he was incarcerated, his cellmate converted him to a belief in voodoo and black magic, and he claimed that black magic gave him an irresistible power and charm over women. For months after being released, Raymond immersed himself in the world of lonely hearts clubs, writing letters to numerous women, often at the same time. In 1947, he began correspondence with Jane Lucia Thompson, who had recently separated from her husband. She was lonely and susceptible to the kindness and was ripe for the picking. After a letter-writing courtship, Jane Thomas agreed to meet Raymond. In October 1947, they bought cruise tickets, which Jane paid for, and took a trip to Spain. For several weeks, they traveled together and booked hotel rooms as man and wife. They dined and took sightseeing trips all across the Spanish countryside. Raymond, though, was still legally married to his first wife, Encarnacion Robles. Eventually, he found his way to La Lina, where Encarnacion lived with his two children. He introduced her to Jane, and for a time, the couple frequently was seen wining and dining together. Now, this was kind of weird because it is not known whether she really knew about all of this or was just going along with it because at this time, the stigma of divorce was something that you really didn't want to have. And things did seem to go very well for a period of time with this newfound love triangle. However, on the night of November 7th, something went wrong. It is believed there was some type of disagreement between Raymond and Jane in the hotel, as he was seen later running out of the hotel room that night. And in the next morning, Jane was found dead in the room of unknown causes. Her body was removed and buried without having an autopsy. Later, when there was suspicions of murder of her being poisoned, the body would be exhumed. At this time, Raymond skipped town, leaving his wife Encarnacion to be alone once again with the children, and nothing was found conclusive about tying him to the murder and potential poisoning of Jane. He catches a boat and goes over to the United States and shows up to Jane's apartment in New York City with a forged last will and testament of Jane in his hand, and he takes possession of the apartment with all furnishings, and despite the fact that Jane's elderly mother lived there. Martha Beck was born in 1920 in Milton, Florida. She was overweight and went through puberty prematurely. After finishing high school, she studied nursing but had trouble finding a job due to her weight. She worked as an undertaker's assistant and prepared female bodies for burial for a short period of time, and eventually she quit that job and moved to California to work in a U.S. Army hospital as a nurse. In 1946, Martha found employment at the Pensacola Hospital for Children, and she quickly rose to become the supervisor of all the nurses in just 6 months' time. Her professional life was finally in a good place. However, her social life was not. Martha was missing love and romance. And so she began writing letters in Mother Dine's Club, which was a newspaper ad placed by someone who was looking to find friendship and romantic partnership. This was one of the many Lonely Hearts clubs of the era. For nearly 2 years, she had no responses, but sometime before Christmas Day in 1947, she received her first and only response. And this was she received her first and only response, and it was from Raymond Fernandez from West 139th Street in New York City. In his letter, Raymond said he was a successful and well-respected businessman who made his fortune in the import and export trade. His words were written in an elaborate manner and extremely courteous and seemed sincere. He wrote that he was a Spaniard who had recently left his country to come to America for better business opportunities, and he now lived alone here in this apartment that was too large for a bachelor, and someday he hoped to share this apartment with a wife. Fernandez also wrote that he knew Martha was a nurse, and he wrote to her, "Because I know you have a full heart with great capacity and comfort for love." And all of this was too much for starry-eyed Martha. She carried the letter with her everywhere she went and read it with every opportunity. She couldn't believe how well he wrote and expressed himself, and immediately she bought expensive stationery and began a 2-week correspondence that included dozens of letters and exchanges of photographs. However, the photographs were a little bit of a problem, and that's because Martha didn't want to scare off this prospective Raymond with a full frontal view of her very generous size, so she would send Raymond group photos of all the nurses at the hospital, and she would be hidden in the back row, so it wasn't overly obvious that she was overweight. And in the letters, she would say things like, "These pictures don't do me justice." So the letters weren't very clear of Martha's perception of weight. However, by this time, Raymond had already defrauded and tricked and deceived and stole from dozens of women all across the country, and he didn't care if his victims were fat, skinny, old, or young. He only had one thing he was looking for, and that was his women to have assets and money. When he learned that Martha was a nurse, he assumed that she had money or a house of something of value. He knew that he would have to develop a relationship by mail and maybe telephone before he could arrange a face-to-face meeting with her. He had to build trust and inspire a level of sexual anticipation in his victims. Through repeated acts of trial and error, he built up a standard routine and followed that script in almost every instance right up to the end. When the victim realized that she had been taken, most of the time, they were reluctant to call the police. They were embarrassed. This is a time period where women didn't really call the police and report things like this because they were shamed on for doing so. This was not a time in which women could feel safe reporting things to the police. After a few letters back and forth, Raymond performed the necessary steps of asking Martha for a lock of hair, and with this hair, he was able to perform his voodoo ritual, which he believed would make Martha unable to resist his sexual charms. Martha was thrilled that someone would be asking for a lock of hair. She had never had that happen before, so she sent a very generous piece of hair with the next letter and doused it with perfume. She was hoping that maybe her time had finally come, and maybe that would be with Raymond. After Raymond built up enough anticipation in Martha, he performed the necessary voodoo ritual and decided time had come for the meeting. He arranged to take a train trip down to Florida for Martha to meet at the station. Now, of course, Martha was extremely nervous because she had not been totally truthful about the size of her weight and her body. However, did not matter. On December 28th, 1947, Raymond arrived in Pensacola, Florida, and while he might have been surprised by Martha's weight, he didn't seem to care, and they were thrilled to be together for once and for all. She couldn't believe how lucky she was to have someone like him in her life, and that is something she had dreamed of every day. They returned to Martha's home, and Martha introduced Raymond to her 2 children. They had dinner together, and when the children were put together, Raymond made a move, and Martha, being so desperate for any kind of attention, was very willing. This went on for a period of a couple days, and because of this, Martha began to think that they were going to be together forever, and that Raymond would marry her. However, that is not what he wanted. He did not want to be married. He wanted to continue his work doing the things he did, conning women out of money and moving on to the next. Suddenly, something spooked him, and he told Martha that he had a business trip that he must attend to in New York, and he needed to return as soon as possible. Martha, very upset and not happy, protested every bit of this trip, and Raymond was able to calm her down, saying things that he would be back soon, or he would send her money so that she could join him in New York. And this is when Martha thought this was a proposal, and that they were going to be together forever. After Raymond boarded the train in Jacksonville, Martha went back to Milton and told everybody that she was going to get married. A shower was prepared in her honor like she had never seen before, and then on the day of the shower, she received a letter from Raymond which said she misunderstood his feelings and he would not be returning to Florida. Martha was absolutely devastated. After she attempted suicide, Raymond then agreed to allow her to come visit in New York. She stayed in New York for 2 weeks with Raymond. After that 2 weeks, when she returned back to Florida, she found out she was fired from her job without explanation, likely because she took 2 weeks off. This is also a time, again, when women were not treated very well, so it is not likely that she had 2 weeks of vacation and was just given off. On January 8th, 1948, Martha picked up her last paycheck and went home to pack. She got her kids dressed and said goodbye to a few friends, and they got on the first bus they could to New York. When they arrived in New York, they went to Raymond's house, and to his surprise, Martha and the children were on his doorstep. Martha quickly moved in and began to cater to his every whim, which he absolutely loved. However, there was just one issue: Martha's children. Raymond was adamant that he wanted absolutely no children, and Martha was adamant that she wanted to spend her life with Raymond. So in order to do that, on January 25th, 1948, Martha sent her children to the Salvation Army so that she could devote her life to Raymond. Once the children were out of the picture, Martha and Raymond had the apartment all to themselves. And this is when Raymond decided to bring out all his lonely heart letters. He told Martha everything that had taken place in the past, the dozens of women he deceived and robbed, his former wife in Spain, and other wives that he's had as well. Martha, who was already committed to this relationship, realized that there was no turning back, and she wanted to continue to stay with him. So they decided that they would continue this plan that he had, and Martha would be part of it. Together, they made the plan for the next victim. And as they pored over the photographs of widows and lonely hearts, they settled upon Miss Esther Heng in southern Pennsylvania. They traveled down to Pennsylvania and met with her, and Martha posed as Raymond's sister-in-law. Within the week, on February 28, 1948, Esther and Raymond were married in a ceremony at the county clerk's office in Fairfax, Virginia. And then the newlyweds, with Martha, returned to the apartment on West 139th Street. She later reported that 4 days she was very polite, and then things began to go downhill after that. Shortly after, the new Mrs. Fernandez decided it was time to leave the apartment, minus her car and the hundreds of dollars which Raymond stole. Several other women followed Esther in this succession, including two named Myrtle. One of them, though, Myrtle Young of Green Forest, Arkansas, agreed to marry Fernandez, and on August 14, 1948, he and Myrtle were married in the Cook County, Illinois. Martha posed as Raymond's sister at this time, and she did everything she could to make sure the marriage would never be consummated, including sleeping in the same bed as Myrtle. How awkward is that? This went on for several days until Myrtle protested so much that Raymond gave her a heavy dose of drugs, which caused her to lapse into unconsciousness. With Martha's help, Raymond carried Myrtle to a bus and sent for the police. They also took $4,000 from her, and on the very next day, Myrtle died at a hospital in Little Rock. The very next day, Myrtle died in a Little Rock hospital. And meanwhile, Martha and Raymond continued to head back east. They stopped in several towns and met with other women along the way. They managed to steal some money, but nothing looked promising and was not a long-term investment. When they arrived back in New York, they started again looking at the Lonely Hearts ads for the next victim, and they found one in New England. But when they went to meet her, she was younger than Martha imagined and wouldn't let Raymond work with their normal scam. Their money was dwindling lower and lower, and winter was coming, and neither one of them had a real job, so they were desperate for more victims. In 1949, they committed 3 murders, the first being Janet Fay. Janet had become engaged to Raymond and moved into the apartment, and when Martha caught Janet in bed with Raymond, she decided she must die, and she struck Janet in the head with a hammer. Raymond then decided to strangle her to make sure she was dead. And when Janet's family began to get suspicious of their disappearance, Martha and Raymond fled to Wyoming Township, Michigan. And while in Michigan, they met Delphine Downing, who was a 28-year-old widow with a 2-year-old daughter. On February 28th, Delphine became agitated with Raymond, and he gave her sleeping pills. Now, you would have thought he would have learned from the last time that he drugged somebody. However, he did. She did not die from an overdose this time, like the last person he gave medication to. But the daughter saw everything and became visibly upset and distraught, and Raymond didn't know what to do. So Raymond decided to strangle the daughter. He did not kill her, and then became extremely nervous. He was afraid that when Delphine wake up, she would see everything that happened, and that is when he decided both Delphine and her daughter must die. He picked up a gun and shot Delphine in the head, and then the daughter was taken into the bathroom and drowned in a tub. Their bodies were then buried in the basement, and when police began searching for them, they eventually were led to Martha and Raymond, where they were arrested on March 1st, 1949. Raymond very quickly confessed to all the murders. They were eventually accused of 17 murders and denied it. And Raymond did retract his confession, and he stated that he only confessed in the beginning because he was trying to protect Martha. However, the police didn't buy his bullshit, and they went to trial. On August 18th, 1949, both Martha and Raymond were found guilty of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to death row on August 22nd. They were extradited to New York to be placed on death row, and on March 8th, 1951, they were executed by electrocution at the Sing Sing prison in New York. This was a very tragic case of preying at people's heartstrings and attacking the young and vulnerable women who were just looking for someone to love them. We hope you found today's story as intriguing as we did, and if you enjoyed this episode, please consider following our podcast and leaving us a comment. Your support helps us bring more chilling tales to your ears. And until next time, stay safe and keep questioning everything.